Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I do believe I'll always start on time, and we'll start on time. Those of you who don't know me, I see some of you faces in the room. My name is Nick Larigakis, and I'm the president of the American Hellenic Institute. On behalf of the AHI, our nonprofit independent Greek-American Public Policy Center, it is my pleasure to present another edition of our Noon Forum series. Today's forum will focus on a discussion on the Council of Foreign Relations Independent Task Force report on Turkey, and will be presented by Ambassador Patrick Theros. The Council of Foreign Relations, of which our distinguished guest speaker is a member, is one of the most respected and influential think tanks in the world today. It sponsors an independent task force when, and I quote, "an issue of current and critical importance to U.S. foreign policy arises," end quote. The task forces are intended to help shape the public debate on critical foreign policy issues. In addition to media outreach, the Council of Foreign Relations supports the efforts of task force chairs and members to reach influential practitioners in the executive branch and in Congress. AHI has long called for a critical review of U.S. policy toward Turkey based upon its unreliability as an ally that stems back to the Cold War through to Operation Iraqi Freedom. Today, Turkey's wayward foreign policy direction has some legislators and policy analysts raising an eyebrow because of its bellicose threats towards Israel, provocative actions towards Cyprus regarding that country's rights to explore for energy in its economic exclusive zone, and its undermining of efforts to impose strong sanctions on Iran in the UN Security Council. This is why the task force report on Turkey, which calls for, and I quote, "a new relationship to be forged with Turkey," is important. Co-chaired by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, is the task force's report the critical review of U.S. policy toward Turkey that AHI has called for? Or is it simply more of the same posturing toward Turkey from the foreign policy community? Does the report include issues such as Cyprus problem or relations in the Aegean with Greece? For answers to these questions and more, we are pleased to have with us Ambassador Patrick Theros, who was one of the 22 task force members, to share his expertise with us today. He will elaborate on the significance of the task force report and why our community needs to pay special attention when such reports are issued by the Council on Foreign Relations. A few words about Ambassador Theros. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Qatar, having served in that post from 1995 until his retirement in 1998. Previously, he served as deputy coordinator for counterterrorism, where he was responsible for the coordination of all U.S. government counterterrorism activities outside the United States. Ambassador Theros also held such positions as political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief, Central Command, Deputy Chief of Mission and Political Officer in Amman, Jordan, and Charge d'Affaires and DCM in Abu Dhabi. Over his 34-year foreign service career, Ambassador Theros served diplomatic posts in Beirut, Managua, Tehran, Abu Dhabi, and at the Department of State. In 1992, he received the President's Meritorious Service Award for Career Officials and the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service. Today, Ambassador Theros is the President and Executive Director of the US-Qatar Business Council. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Patrick Theros.
Nick, thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here. This is what I've always thought to be the best of the organizations in Washington working on Hellenic issues. I will try and run through this in two parts. The first part is a discussion of the substance of the report and how it came about. And the second, and to me the more important one, is the role that organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations play in the formulation and execution of American foreign policy. The United States has not had a serious review of policy with Turkey for probably the greater part of my career. policy was established early in the days of NATO. Turkey was a big country and a strategic part of the world. It was a counterbalance to the Soviet Union. It had the biggest army in NATO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You all know, had the most strategic position. And therefore, there was, what I must say, an almost mindless catering to Turkish interests all through the end of the Cold War. Turkey is blessed with a particularly effective foreign policy establishment. It has a lot of very good diplomats. It has what I regard as a united and continuous foreign policy, one that has not changed perhaps since the loss of Constantinople in 1453. They know what they inherited the Byzantine diplomatic service, and the continuity continues. So much so that they are one of the few countries with whom the United States has relations that really understands how the American foreign policy process works. And to the point that at the end of the Cold War, one day I was visiting a friend of mine who was the then director of the Office of Southeast European Affairs, who, this was Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, and so forth. He was an old friend, we were just talking, and he said, I am so lucky. Brookings has just produced a policy paper on Turkey. And I know, he knows, we were all in the same bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy is so overwhelmed with day-to-day affairs that it rarely has a chance to sit down and think about long-term policies. Brookings produced a paper. And he showed me the paper. And the paper essentially said, if you thought Turkey was important during the Cold War, watch how important it's going to be now. It was beautifully written, well argued, extremely well presented, and I was astounded that Brookings had managed to produce this in such a short period of time. It essentially said that Turkey is the key to Central Asia, Turkey is the key to exploiting the collapse of the Soviet Union, Turkey is the model for progress and democracy in the Muslim world, etc., and it did it with some really good arguments. I said, and Brookings did this? He said, yeah, Brookings just produced it, brought us, and now we're looking at it seriously in the state, and this is going to be probably the basis the papers will go forward in terms of American policy. I don't know very many people on Brookings. Sometime later, I was with a Turkish friend, a very senior Turkish diplomat named Özlem Sandberg, who had been the Turkish ambassador to London, and then later the Secretary General of the Turkish Foreign Ministry, and at the time that I was meeting him, this is what I was talking about, 91, 92, the head of Turkey's equivalent of the Council of Foreign Relations, on secondment from the Foreign Ministry, not retired. And in the course of a 15-minute conversation, it became very obvious he'd written the paper. Not he himself personally, but the Turkish equivalent of the Council of Foreign Relations had written the paper and then placed it in Brookings. And placed it in Brookings and allowed Brookings to go over it, and then Brookings put it forward. The Turks understand the role that these major foreign affairs think tanks play in the U.S. government. The think tanks provide the intellectual capital which an overburdened bureaucracy can't provide, can't cope with. It was a wonderfully written piece of paper. This, I have to say, is probably a great privilege to have participated in this independent task force. This is probably the first such task force, first such policy review in the United States on the relationship with Turkey that originated within the United States. Came out entirely, this is an American product. It is not a Turkish product. Mind you, the task force included a large number of people who are familiar with Turkey, who are Turkish Americans, who've dealt with Turkey. I was one of the few people who brought another perspective to the task force. However, we're lucky because two things have happened with regard to Turkey that have caused the United States to look for the first time, in my view, in my career, have caused the United States for the first time to look at the U.S.-Turkish relationship ab initio. Let's go back to basics and say, what are we going to do? And those two events are the coming to power of the AKP with Erdogan, essentially the dismantling and emasculating of Turkey's military and the collapse of the Turkish relationship with Israel. And let me tell you why both these events are important. We built a relationship with Turkey since the end of World War II, based on the assumption that there will be a militarily controlled semi-democratic government in Ankara. It was secular, which is one of the things we liked. It had the facade of democracy, which is one of the things we liked. It was firmly in the Western camp, which was one of the things we liked. And they were pretty good at what they did in terms of looking after their interests, which occasionally coincided with ours as well. This has now collapsed. We have lost our traditional allies inside the Turkish establishment. The collapse came probably with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when the Turkish military tried to persuade the Turkish parliament to allow us to move troops through northern Iraq. Frankly, I think that was the best thing that happened to us, that they turned us down. The addition of sending an additional division into northern Iraq would have been an exercise in futility. It was pointless. The Iraqi army was getting out of our way. It would have served no military utility, but it did two things. One, it deeply undermined the ability of the Turkish military to control politics, because frankly the invasion of Iraq was extremely unpopular in Turkey. And secondly, it drove a wedge between the Turkish military and the neoconservatives, who Mr. Wolfowitz, in a moment that can only describe as incredible insanity, actually threatened the Turkish government with a coup by the Turkish military if they didn't reverse their position. Perhaps one of the most imbecilic statements I've ever heard in my life. Mr. Wolfowitz is not a friend of mine, so. Secondly, the AKP came to power because after ruling Turkey roughly from 1925 until 2000 and something, the Turkish military had become ossified, corrupt, authoritarian, and increasing. Corruption is probably the overwhelming adjective, the most important adjective you should use. So, and a new government has come to power, an Islamist, semi-Islamist, however you choose to categorize it. This new government has two characteristics that should never be underestimated in terms of their appeal to the Turkish people. First of all, is they are, by comparison to the regime that went before, remarkably uncorrupt. Secondly, they are much more liberal, even though they are not liberal in our sense, in the treatment of Turkey's minorities and in terms of dealing with the population of Turkey. The Turkish people, for the first time, feel empowered. It's also a government that is very business friendly. Footnote here, virtually every Islamist government around the world, except the Iranian one, is very business friendly. They tend to draw their people from the middle classes, from the business classes. But so we have lost the relationships that we had with the Turkish military, which governed Turkey. That's the first step. Second step is the Turkish military had created a relationship between Turkey and Israel that benefited essentially both sides. For Israel, it was the relationship with the enemy of my enemy. Syria has always been, and Iraq to a lesser degree, has always been the most feared of Israel's neighbors. And now you had a good, strong military relationship with a country on the other side of Syria. For Turkey, it produced a lot of benefits in terms of money, in terms of military equipment, in terms of technology transfer, training, and very importantly, it turned the American Jewish community into an apologist for Turkey in the United States. Erdogan, at this point we're getting into my opinion rather than opinion reinforced by some Turkish friends. Erdogan chose to break with Israel precisely because the relationship had been created by the Turkish military. This was his tool for beating the Turkish military into submission. Israel was so unpopular, particularly after the invasion of Lebanon and the Gaza invasion, so unpopular in Turkey that the Turkish military could not be seen publicly as supporting the relationship with Israel. And Erdogan played on that. He played on public sympathies, and he has systematically emasculated the Turkish military. I think I can now say for the first time in my adult life that we are past the possibility of the Turkish military conducting the kind of internal coup that they used to do on a regular basis. You now have a firmly ensconced government in Ankara that is no longer afraid of its military. So the United States, for the first time, has a country that has advanced economically very well, progressive government in the business and commercial sense. Turkey's economy has improved significantly. Turkey is playing a much bigger role in the area, and all the old rules dealing with the U.S.-Turkish relationship are gone. So it's time, for the first time, to sit down and say, okay, how do we deal with Turkey? We are lucky in this confusion that apparently the Turkish Foreign Ministry felt that they didn't have to do this again. So for the first time, it was left to an American institution to try and sit down and formulate a new relationship with Turkey. There are I've given a couple of copies here. It's available on the web, so at some point, if people are interested, I'd recommend you read through it. There is the first part of the first recommendation I'd like to read to you so that you get an idea of how the U.S. now sees it. The United States needs to recognize that today it is dealing with a dramatically changed Turkey, and that as a result, the bilateral relationship between Washington and Ankara is undergoing fundamental change. American officials, members of Congress, and other observers must jettison their stereotypes of Turkey, in particular the decline in the role of the military in Turkish political life. It does not mean that Turkey is inexorably heading toward theocracy or moving away from NATO. The rise of the religiously oriented AKP party is not inconsistent with democracy, modernization, or economic liberalism. The United States must not view the sum of U.S.-Turkish relations through the narrow prisms of particular issues, whether they be Armenia, Israel, or ties to NATO. And it goes on to say about how we have to work our way through the Armenian issue. But the U.S.-Turkey relationship is much broader than the Armenian tragedy, the apartheid state of Turkey-Israel relations, or the false debates about Turkey's place in the West. And the relationship has to be expanded and deepened. The United States needs to see Turkey as a potential strategic partner with which it has a relationship comparable not only to that with newer partners such as India and Brazil, but ultimately that with its closest allies such as Japan and South Korea. Turkey needs to see the United States in the same way, recognizing, however, that for all the potential in the new U.S.-Turkey partnership, there are limitations to what the U.S. two countries can effectively achieve without adherence to the following principles: equality and mutual respect for each other's interests, mutual trust, intensive consultations to identify common goals, no surprises, and recognition. And then it goes on to talk at some length about the potential failures, the potential problems in Turkey, particularly in the human rights side, in the political rights and modernization. This is the first time I've ever seen a very serious U.S. document where it goes on for several pages dealing with those problems, with lack of democracy, with a disturbing trend towards, towards censoring the press, towards throwing newsmen in jail and so forth. The dynamics, without going into the names of the people involved, of the sessions were very interesting. There were 6 or 7 members of the task force who were either Turkish Americans or had very close ties with Turkey. They were all violently AKP. They were all people with very close ties to the Kemalists and to the military, and were probably the people most bent on producing a piece of paper that would be hostile to the relationship with the current government in Turkey. There were several people on the task force closely identified with Israel. Their views were very ambivalent. And how do you deal, because they saw the relationship with Turkey through that prism. A few people, a small number of people on the task force thought that nothing had changed, that this was 1985, 1990, and nothing had changed. Out of that came a document that I think is it the document that I would have liked to have seen come out at the end? No, but it is a document that at least puts U.S.-Turkish relationships on a more realistic basis and provides an opportunity for those of us, whether associated with a Hellenic community, Armenians and elsewhere, where we can have a discussion and a dialogue inside the U.S. foreign policy establishment that would have not been possible a few years ago. The basic idea is that Turkey is no longer the staunch, willing, able, enthusiastic ally, which it never was, but this was the mythology that dominated Washington for all these years. And this is the conclusion of this paper. Paper realistically assesses the fact that Turkey is now one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has real strength, political, military, and so forth. And that it will act in its own interests. We are no longer fooling ourselves into believing that Turkey will act in our interests. And it's just a question of how do we deal with a country that acts in its own interests. In other words, now we got to deal with Turkey like we deal with normal countries, with countries that have national interests and will pursue those national interests. And which is much harder actually, because Washington is a town full of glib short phrases that says this is the way, this is Turkey, we put it in this category and does everything that way. It's like our politics. I'd be happy to discuss some of the details later, but let me go a little bit into the role of the think tanks and why this is so important for us as a community. The way U.S. government policy is formulated today has changed dramatically from, say, 1974. The foreign policy establishment is larger. Come on, off. Foreign policy establishment is larger, more diverse, has less internal cohesion, and is driven by mostly domestic factors as they input in. The only part of the foreign policy establishment that actually looks at foreign policy as foreign policy are the Washington think tanks. Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, name them, right down the line. These are also the institutions from which each new U.S. administration pulls in its people. There are some administrations pull their people in more heavily from ideologically oriented institutions like the American Heritage Foundation, the American AEI, others from more leftist, but it depends, or heavily from the CFR, because the CFR still occupies that great middle ground that has not yet been defined where it stands politically. They are important. They are very important. What we are lacking as a community, as a political movement, if you want to put it that way, is a presence in the institutions. And I've repeated this, a few people here have heard this already. There are approximately 4,000 members of the Council on Foreign Relations, of whom 1,500 are quite active. I've been able to identify 8 Greek Americans in that group. I can identify at least 50 or 60 Turkish Americans in that group, and another 100 or 200 people who at one point or other have been in the payroll of the Turkish government. We don't even have anybody on, I can't identify anybody in the group who's been on the payroll of the Greek government or the Cypriot government in that group. For the longest time, a Greek American was head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Pete Peterson. I don't believe that anyone ever had a discussion with him on issues of importance to the Hellenic community in this country. And the same applies to Brookings, the same applies to elsewhere. But I'm not even going to go into why. But let me tell you why it was important that you had somebody knowledgeable, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was invited to join the task force and was able to play a role in formulating the response. When I got there, listened to the first discussions, there literally, the original draft did not have the word Greece once. Anywhere in the original draft did the word Greece appear anywhere. Anywhere throughout the original draft, there was one reference to Cyprus in terms of the natural gas finds. And a second reference that said that, of course, the Turks are upset at Europe because they allowed Cyprus to get into the EU before, despite having voted against the Annan Plan. And that literally was the only reference to Greece and to Cyprus in the original draft. I am neither the smartest guy on that group nor the only qualified person in this community to do it. I just happen to be the only one there who had the credentials where I was able to speak up and know how the system operates, so that we were able to to make some changes that I regarded as favorable changes in the report. There was a long discussion on Turkey being the gas powerhouse. That Turkey would be the substitute for Russia in the supply of gas to Europe, and that this would enhance the importance of Turkey. There were two of us on the task force who knew something about gas. One was the head of BP North Atlantic, and myself, because I've served in countries that pump gas. Turkey wants to be a hub. It wants to control the flow. None of the producer countries will permit Turkey to do that. The countries that have put pipelines against Turkey have essentially said to Turkey, there's two kinds of gas that goes through Turkey. First one is the stuff that you buy for your domestic purpose, and you pay us for it. And the second is the stuff that comes through Turkey on a pipeline, and we pay you a fee, but you have absolutely no control over where the stuff goes, or pricing, or who the customers are. And a large part, the initial discussion was, how do we make Turkey into the hub controlling the flow of gas into Europe? And the answer was, you can't, but it took people knowledgeable on the subject to convince the academics and the others who were politicians who were on the task force that this wasn't possible. To go on. We had this discussion on the Annan Plan and why Greece had voted, why the Greek Cypriots had voted against the Annan Plan, and the way the language was phrased. It was, of course, the Turks are upset because the Greeks voted against the Annan Plan and they still got into the EU. And after a long argument, I had the following inserted as a footnote into the, or an endnote, I should say, into the report. Task Force Member Patrick Theros notes, Turkey accepted that the EU summit decision in Copenhagen in December 2002 to admit the Republic of Cyprus was final, even if no final solution to the Cyprus problem was achieved prior to the May 1st, 2004 formal accession date. What that means is the Turkish complaint that they got double-crossed. Turkey explicitly accepted that Cyprus was now inside Europe, and the only difference was that the Annan Plan vote was before the accession date, but it didn't make any difference because it didn't matter what was going to happen with the Annan Plan. Cyprus was coming into the EU at that time. There was no mention throughout the initial stages of the report about tensions in the Aegean and territorial claims. Again, I will take credit for this, but this shouldn't come as a surprise. This wasn't rocket science. The tension, there's a recommendation. The tension over territory and territorial waters in the Aegean is long-standing, but Washington should use its diplomatic and political capital to contain the dispute. Greece is racked with unprecedented political and economic crises and represents no threat to Turkey. Turkey should avoid anything to suggest that Ankara seeks to take advantage of Athens' current troubles. Moreover, the potential for accidents and unintended escalation is great. This would set Turkey-Greece relations back and make it harder to come to a solution for competing claims in the Aegean. And then it goes on to say, we ought to be looking at ways to deconflict, but it is clearly not in the U.S. interest to stand aside and let the Turks continue to do provocative actions in the Aegean. There was another item that got taken out, so I can't read anything to you. which was leaving the question of the U.S. view towards the legal status of the gas deposits above outside of Cyprus, off Cyprus, in limbo. Conclusion was you didn't need to address this because it was now clear, absolute U.S. policy, that the Cypriot legal position is unassailable. So there's no, and this actually, a lady who's also not my friend, Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, addressed us at one point and said clearly we've made that statement to Turkey. This is now an unassailable position. Cyprus's legal situation is clear and cannot change. And it appears a footnote here as well, something a little somewhat more flimsily worded, but it appears as a footnote. Anyway, I believe that much of what we do as a community here needs to focus on the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, and much less on Congress. Congress, for example, which has been the focus of our efforts through the years, has been become increasingly irrelevant to the day-to-day conduct of American foreign policy. It doesn't matter if we get resolutions, if we get unless you get a vote that says the Congress directs the U.S. Embassy to close the embassy in Ankara, which is somewhat unlikely. Everything else that Congress does right now is so tied up with the domestic side of things that it just will allow to drift. So, having gone through 25 minutes of my 50 allotted time, I'd like to have a discussion so I can address some of the other issues that might have come up or didn't come up in this. This is overwhelming. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ambassador Theros, thank you for
Let me
your comments.
just-
Oh,
Just first of all, thank Ambassador Theros for this a very extraordinary, interesting presentation. And now we will open to questions and answers, but house rules are just that you identify yourself for the record.
I'm Aphrodite Buikidis. I currently work with Ashoka. I used to work with the National Democratic Institute, and I wanted to ask you, it's interesting what you say about the role of think tanks on foreign policy establishment. I wasn't sure to what extent that it really was impactful or how, but I wonder what your comments would be on organizations that implement on the ground democracy and governance programs in the regions, because I know NDI had programs in Central and Eastern Europe, some programs in Turkey, but not as many in like EU member states and Greece. So I wonder what connections could be there, or what role that would play in things like this.
This has been a delicate subject.
Yeah.
Good example is what's happened in the National Democratic Institute and the Republic Institute in Egypt, when the Egyptian military decided to close them down. It wasn't quite that blunt, but in fact that's what they did. That went over very well among the Egyptian public. American institutions, Russian institutions, British, French institutions suffer from a perception that we are there to do something to them, not for them. Indian institutions, Chinese actually are in really good shape, except they don't promote democracy. But institutions that come out of other countries, shared institutions, do have far more credibility in that part of the world than do American, British, French, and if there are any Russian institutions. And it's a question of national credibility. We're popular because we provide free meals, we give people scholarships, we do nice little seminars to which everybody comes and gets to hobnob with important people. I doubt that they have a great deal of influence. And again, they are seen as foreign institutions. And nobody in Egypt stood up for us when they closed down the Democratic and Republican democracy-building institutions. If you want to do things with the U.S., if the U.S. wants to do things, let me rephrase that, other than changing our foreign policy, which is like changing a tanker, its course in midstream, is do things in the United States. The most influential thing that the United States can do is bring people here for educational purposes, whether it's short-term education or long-term education. If we cut out every other piece of country building, nation building in the world, and substituted for with education of any sort in the United States, we would be way ahead of the game. Other countries have more influence. I also represent the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, and this has been the focus of Greek foreign aid in the Middle East. And other than some scandals that you will read about shortly over money being diverted to a couple of politicians, they had a very effective educational program, which was both supporting schools in Jordan and Palestine and Israel, K through 12, and providing scholarships for students to come to Greece. Patriarch of Jerusalem used to be, still is, condemned daily by Palestinian Christians because he doesn't give scholarships to, only exclusively to Palestinian Christians or Jordanian Christians. He gives 80% of his scholarships to Muslim kids from good families. Because these are the kids that are come home and run Jordan, run Palestine in the future. So as I said, 80% of his scholarships go to Muslim kids from good families. And because it is effective. Because every one of these kids then comes back with his bachelor's degree, quarter them with Greek wives, and at that point they are firm. They are the firmest Philhellenes I've ever seen. I once sat at a table, because Greece used to have a program of taking a couple of Air Force cadets into the Greek Air Force Academy from Jordan. And when I was at Central Command, I sat at a table in which it was me, 2 visitors from Washington, and 7 Jordanian senior Air Force officers. The 2 visitors from Washington were the only non-Greek speakers at the table. Everybody else there spoke Greek, went to Greece, loved Greece, did all sorts of things that had to do something with Greece. So if you want to make people love you, bring them here, educate them here. You're going to lose a certain percentage of them who are going to stay here, but it doesn't matter. You've built ties. And if we had been, say, in Syria 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I was, has it been 40 years ago? Anyway, a long time ago, when I was in Syria, we had an extensive aid program, building roads, some other thing. If we had turned all those aid programs into scholarships for the kids of the Alawite establishment, I think we would be seeing a much different Syria today.
Any other questions?
Sir.
Nicholas Kritos, I'm the first political counselor of the Greek Embassy. Thank you very much for your intervention. First of all, I do share the approach of yours as far as the whole concept of the report, and I would like to say 2 things, and I need your answer. I think that the only missing thread to this approach made by the report is that in trying to depict this new Turkey, there is no reference to a possibility to see this new Turkey leaving aside the revisionist power that it was, at least from the Kemalist onwards, not from Kemal, from the Kemalist onwards. And this is something that is missing. Because
I'm not sure I understand the...
That means through the Kemalists, Turkey was a revisionist power in the region. We don't accept the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then we saw all the problems with Greece and so on and so forth. This is my question. And the second one is that sometimes we say something about Turkey that is changing right now, and I agree. And I think that the way that we have to approach the whole problem is that we need to see Greece to have a say for the region and for the world as a whole. And that will bring also think tanks to write such a, let's say, a reports also for Greece. This is my personal view.
2 parts. The first part is I couldn't agree with you more. The current government in Ankara was driven by the desire to emasculate the military. It did whatever it had to do to put the military in its place, which overall, for the good of most of the world, is probably a good thing. they are very conscious of historical continuity. Devletoglu in particular, every now and then sounds like the Grand Vizier of Muhammad the Conqueror. He gets carried away from time to time, and somebody's got to sort of stuff him back in the bag. But I don't think the essence of Turkish foreign policy has changed. What I believe has changed is, and this could be positive or dangerous, is they've gotten smarter. The military had a set view of the world that depended in large part on suppressing popular tendencies inside Turkey. AKP doesn't have that problem anymore. AKP basically has managed to, within certain parameters of course, has managed to address a lot of the internal difficulties that the military faced in Turkey, and therefore is freer to operate on the outside. Now, AKP faces elections, which the military never had to worry about. So I think they're acting like the Republican Party in Florida. Let's see if we can disenfranchise people we don't like. But having said that, they are still facing elections. They know that they need to keep the economy going, and they need to keep the economy going and growing. And this is an economy that, although it is booming, has a lot of internal contradictions that could turn sour on it very quickly. So I don't believe there's any change in Turkish foreign policy. Iran's the same way. I was present once at a meeting with at Brookings, as a matter of fact, with the Qatari Emir and Foreign Minister, in which somebody asked him, why should we be supporting reformist movements inside Iran? And the Qatari response was, if you want to do it for the good of the Iranian people, that's fine, but remember, we've been dealing with Iran since the days of Darius and Xerxes. Their foreign policy has never changed. So they have a continuous foreign policy. Turkey has...
Yes, but this is the real continuity.
Yeah.
I understand, but Turkey
has a continuity.
Turkey has a continuity. There is a difference. Kemal changed Kemal, by his advent, changed the whole Ottoman way of thinking, because the first necessity was to establish a nation.
Yes.
Right now we have a new Turkey trying to see the past. I don't know if can understand that the Ottoman Empire is not only out of the blue, there is also a previous continuity, which is also the Anatolian Roman one, and a Roman also.
Right.
That means, I don't know, in that sense, has also to accept certain things.
The Turkish foreign policy today is freer because it no longer has the secular, anti-religious, narrow ethnic constrictions of Kemalist foreign policy. It is less free because the Kemalists didn't care about economics. When you're running a quasi-dictatorship, you don't really care if people are poor or rioting in the streets. So this is the balance. Where that balance is going, I'll tell you, the one conclusion that came out of this report is we have no idea where the balance is going. We need to position ourselves to deal with whatever direction it goes in. On the second one, I couldn't agree more. It's one of the reasons I'm making this presentation here. My problem is that it's a push, it's got to be a push scenario, not a pull scenario. Until Greece begins to assert itself with a foreign policy, a coherent foreign policy backed up by at least some coherent intellectual exercise, because no one's going to pay attention. This has to come from Greece and from Greeks. One of my big complaints about current Greek government is most of the talent among Greeks today is among Greeks in the diaspora, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of knowledge of what's going on abroad. And to date, as it has since I don't know when, the diaspora is not a welcome participant in the formulation of Greek policy. And I think there are a lot of people. I mean, why you can pass up somebody like, never mind me, I'm an egotist, but I know I have my limitations, but you pass up a guy like Stavridis or a guy like Negroponte, all of whom have a great deal of affection for the old country. And they have never been invited, never been consulted, no one's ever asked like that. There is talent there, but the talent is not in the Greek establishment. Sure.
Finance and President of the American University of Iraq. I find what you said about the continuity of Turkish politics manifest there in important ways. I was talking to the chairman of our board, who happened to have been Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region until the day before yesterday. He was making a thumbnail sketch of the history of the place. He said, this is a place where Turks and Iranians have always clashed. This Iraq business is sort of a joke of history. And now, of course, he says, the Turks are present, the Iranians are present, the Russians are present, the Americans are absent. It is true that we have created a vacuum in which a Pax Turkica is an if Pax be the right word, seems to be the point. But I think the continuity, the strategic depth, as our friend Gutula would say, does take this form of a commercial, this extraordinary attention to commerce, which comes with the rising of these middle classes from Aydin, from Afyonkara. They're not the Istanbuli and the Ankara elites. Gives perhaps also a possibility of hope, in that strategic depth may be something that becomes negotiable. Money is negotiable as opposed to territory, as opposed to. And I was wondering, again, coming back to the, I'm sorry, I'm saying too many things, to the, I think, absolutely decisive and critical issue of the gas discoveries that are both emotional and real. I wonder how far the legal recognition will hold. I wonder how much it will be challenged, and I wonder how many things it will be questioned when the Turkish neighbors, and when the Turkish government says we have a neighbor, we know what it's for. One wonders about how justifications from an American think tank are going to hold them back.
These are not just the American think tank took note of the fact that the U.S. the U.S. State Department has now unequivocally taken the position that the
Right.
Cypriot legal position is unassailable.
Right.
When you get into real politics,
Yes.
I have to congratulate the Cypriots for basically making this a joint venture with the Israelis. So,
Let me make some comments. One, regarding the Greek foreign policy. I think the biggest problem they've had over the years, more than continuity of their foreign policy, is how they promote their foreign policy abroad. I don't think it's completely understood. And certainly it's not to the degree of how Turkey has promoted its foreign policy in the United States by having reports like this being issued in major think tanks regarding Greece. I don't think these happen by accident. And you can only speculate what I want to say there, but I won't say it. And, we cover, Turkey in discussions around think tanks in this town, and it's amazing to me, and we have our interns and our staff go and cover these hearings, and then we issue out statements on them in terms of the synopsis of these hearings. And it's amazing how many of these happen in this town on a just daily basis, practically. And Greece just doesn't get that kind of attention, and I think that's where Greece fails. But in terms of what Greece does in reality, I think is way above what Turkey does in terms of its as an ally of the West and within NATO. And again, they don't say it for a lot of reasons, of which one of them is their internal political dynamics between, their leftists and their right side. I can only imagine what it must have been like for you to be in this group trying to defend or bring attention to some of these issues. And one of the things that struck me is how little attention that Greece and Cyprus got in this, and you telling me it got even less than what it has now.
there was no mention whatsoever.
And it just surprises me that there was no title for Cyprus or for Greece. Just two elements of our play extremely into the whole Turkish dynamic. But just a couple of points here. Under the recommendations under the European Union, as it relates to Cyprus, it says here, is extraordinary sensitive conflict on Cyprus and the widely held narrative in Turkey and the United States and the EU that Ankara and the island's Turkish community did what they could to resolve the problem by voting overwhelmingly in support of the 2004 Annan Plan, even as the Greek Cypriots voted against it in large numbers. So that comment there alone, if you read it within that context, is to put all the blame on the Greek Cypriots and now bring to the forefront the complications of the Annan Plan. I mean, nowhere in here does it talk about 43,000 occupation troops on the island in violation of various laws that we need to get onto. Under NATO, under NATO, as it relates to Greece's territorial waters, and I quote, whether or not Greece's claims about the Turkish military are warranted, is how it starts this one particular sentence. Again, bringing up, gray areas regarding how it views the situation in the Aegean Sea. And what was the problem of reinforcing U.S. policy regarding Cyprus's right to explore its economic exclusive zone, for its gas findings? It would have been a stronger point to bring in that, in fact, this is U.S. policy. But they decided to leave that out, and I wonder why they decided to do that. Again, this is not a negative towards you.
No, I understand, and let me tell you
Just some
very
observations
briefly on
regarding the
both
report.
ones. On getting any mention of the Aegean in there was an uphill fight. There were a number of people who said, no, the Turks are not being provocative, they've stepped down. I said, read something. And this was actually quite an argument that I had on, there is a problem. There had been a bit of a hiatus some years back, 2 or 3 years back, and everybody had just assumed that this had continued. That there had been no, so it took a fair amount of effort and research and arguing to get what we got into it. On the question of sovereignty over the gas fields, the view there was this issue is closed, the U.S. government has spoken, this is our position, and it's, there's no point to going into it, and frankly, it was a battle I chose not to. You got to pick your arguments to a certain degree. On the occupation forces and so forth, again, you can only take arguments so far before you start cutting into your own credibility. Regardless of the accuracy of the argument, you have to maintain a certain credibility. So, had I had a couple more people on the task force who were as knowledgeable, I'm not talking about sympathetic, I'm just saying knowledgeable. Nobody in the task force knew anything about the Aegean. Or if they did, they didn't speak up. If we had more people inside the Council on Foreign Relations who knew something about the subject, this would make a difference. Which is very interesting. Al Jazeera had a series of small shows in which they were interviewing Turkish students a couple of weeks ago. And there was a very lively discussion going on about the future of democracy, in which they were interviewing students from the most conservative to the most leftist. But there was a very, very lively discussion going on. I'd like to see a discussion like that going on in Greece sometimes, where students sit down and it's not just my football team and my political party are the same thing, which happens to, I think.
This gentleman over here.
Armen Saak, I'm from the Armenian National Committee of America. Thank you very much for the presentation, and I'm really looking forward to go and read the report. But before I do that, you mentioned Armenia a couple of times, and I'm wondering if Armenia, or the question of the Armenian genocide, has found its place in the report, and if it has, in what capacity?
There was an attempt to avoid spending too much time on the genocide. There was far more of a desire to see if there was a way to encourage a rapprochement between the Republic of Armenia and Ankara in that discussion, and that the idea of the genocide should be left to the Republic of Armenia to work it out with Turkey.
Gentleman in the back.
I'm Cvitin Shilimanov from the Macedonian Information Agency, and I thank you for your comments so far. What struck me was your comments regarding that the openness, the benefits reached when, for example, the Greek Patriarch is open toward accepting people to study in Greece. In a much larger scale, would you comment, basically the largest pull force for Turkey toward Europe would have been, maybe not EU membership, but a bigger right of travel, more access to the European market, and while of course Greece, Cyprus are not the main countries which are blocking Turkey from accessing this, they're seen as the most vocal in this. Would you say that this was a missed chance to orient Turkey more toward Europe? And again, I come from Macedonia, we've had a similar situation. Once the door is closed, you start looking for doors elsewhere, including Turkey, for example. We are turning strongly toward Turkey because this is where investments comes from, this is where political support comes from, and to what extent would you say that Greece has used, maybe not used, this possibility which it held in its hands for Turkey.
I admire the Germans for their ability to create a lack of to create a story from a lack of reality. At this point, I think the Greek attitude towards Turkish EU entry is one of, if they meet the criteria, let them. My kids all have both passports. My daughter showed up in Istanbul to go to a conference last month. There was a long line for people who need visas, which means all American citizens. And there's another line for people who don't need visas, which includes all Europeans, including Greeks. She calls me, she said, what should I do? Because my ticket is in my name in English and my passport's in my name in Greek. And I said, what the hell, try it. Because otherwise it was an hour's wait. She was through the other side of the border in about 30 seconds. Turks coming into Greece who have a visa, and there's large numbers of them, have no problem. There is a major political problem between Greece and Turkey, and it's not going to go away, I think, in my lifetime. In terms of the EU, I fear that Turkey's EU bid is dead. If it is dead, it means Greece has no leverage left. And it's as simple as that. If there is leverage, it's as if there were a live possibility of Turkey's accession to the EU. Cyprus has used it, I think, somewhat more aggressively to get leverage, and it's going to be very interesting when Cyprus takes over the EU presidency, which they have, to watch just how many small collisions there are going to be. Because I think we're going to have the next 6 months of people getting insulted and walking out of meetings and things like that.
If I may just add, I think it's Greece and Cyprus who have sort of led the way regarding Turkey's European aspirations and said we want Turkey in the European Union as long as you fill the criteria. It has nothing to do with Islam or Christian. It has to do with fulfilling that criteria. That club is made up of criteria. And I would venture to say today that Turkey has its cake and eats it too, because they're part of the customs union, of which they enjoy all the benefits of trading with the European Union without having to deal with all the rights of religious freedom, acquis communautaire, and so forth. And just for the record, until Greece's economic problems, I believe they were the #1 investor in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and I think today they're about 5th or 6th. Still heavily invested in that country, and wants that country to also aspire to join the European Union once certain criteria are fulfilled. So,
Greece was one of the largest investors in Turkey as well prior to the conflict.
Yeah, National Bank of Greece was a major investor there. Well, we certainly appreciate this insight into the the think tank community in Washington and the role that it plays. We can only appreciate, as I said, what you've gone through in this process. We appreciate you coming out today and sharing the dynamics of what went on. And I'd like to ask you the one last question. And then everyone join us in the back for some light refreshments, and we'll look forward to our next such forum sometime in the fall. From 1 to 10, 1 being the least and 10 being the most, how objective is this report? Just a number.
It's as objective as a committee can get.
1 through 10.
8.
8. On that, we'll let it go.
As a committee, keep something in mind about committees.
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, and have an enjoyable rest of the summer.
Camel is a horse designed by committee. I think
acquire the house.
So you ask them, but everything is for sale. Ο ζωγράφος, νομίζω δεν είδα. Νομίζω.
That means they need it. If they this
You're going
they
to Greece
they
next week?
need it.
Ναι, πάμε αύριο στην
My husband is zealous
θα
people.
παρουσιάσουμε το documentary εκεί. Πέμπτη το πρωί. Λίγο Παλαιστίνη και θα με την αλλά τελευταία εβδομάδα
Τι δύναμη έχουν και αρνούν τις πιθανότητες να έχουν το Πατριαρχείο
We've met, but I don't think we've been introduced.
και θα μπορούσαν να εκμεταλλευτούν για όφελος. Ίσως λέει και καλό μας είναι που δεν το εκμεταλλεύονται. Αλλά λέει, αν η Τουρκία λέει έχει να εκμεταλλευτεί το σοβαρό. Τέλος πάντων.
Διαφωνώ γιατί πιστεύω ότι το έχει κλεμμένο.
Όχι.
Δεν το δει.
Αν έχεις το Πατριαρχείο όχι σαν στόχο να το μειώνεις, αλλά σαν...
Το έχει σαν στόχο.
Αλλά δεν μπορεί όμως για να μπορεί να δώσει την στον Πατριαρχείο, πρέπει να του δώσει τα προνόμια τα παλιά. Χωρίς αυτά τα προνόμια, όπως ο Πατριάρχης Ιερουσαλήμου τώρα, έχουν μια μικρή μειονότητα. Έχει φοβερό κύρος. Διότι έχει την εκτίμηση, φοβερή ανοιχτή εκτίμηση από την Παλαιστινιακή Αρχή, από τους Ισραηλινούς και από τους Ιορδανούς. Τα τρία κράτη που είναι η ενορία του Πατριάρχη.
Δεν ξέρω αν θα έρθει ποτέ αυτό από την Τουρκία. Αυτό που θα ήθελα να δω όμως, θα ήθελα να δω κάποιες αξίες για να βοηθήσουμε τον πρέπει να μιλήσουμε φυσικά και όχι.
Αλλά η τώρα...
Αλλά εμείς δεν είμαστε έτοιμοι να το βοηθήσουμε έτσι. Αυτό και ο άνθρωπος είναι και σταυρωμένος. Τα λέει για
Λέω, αλλά η τώρα το θέμα της ήταν αν οι Τούρκοι μπορούσαν να εκμεταλλευτούν σαν ορθόδοξοι και σαν να είχαν αποκτήσει.
εγώ πιστεύω ότι θέλουμε.
Το έχουν κάνει πολύ ατζαμίδικα.
Εγώ πιστεύω ότι νομίζω ότι δεν μπορούμε να τα δώσουμε όλα. Γιατί είναι πολύ μικρό και η κοινότητα εκεί και τα περιουσιακά της στοιχεία πρέπει να δοθούν σιγά σιγά. Να μην τα φάνε καν τίποτα πρόβλημα. Και θέλει και λίγο προσοχή να το παίζουν και με εμάς το σου λέει αυτό δεν κάνουν τίποτα. Δεν διορθώνουν λάθος. Για τον μουσουλμάνο δεν κάνουν τίποτα. Γενικά δεν τους ενδιαφέρει όλο. Η Τουρκία πλέον μας βλέπει όλους. Μας βλέπει έδαφος. Αυτό είναι το μη συμφέρον. Δεν είναι πλέον ρεβίζιο. Μας θεωρεί ίδρυμα. Όλο το έδαφος. Και αυτό είναι το πιο μεγάλος φόβος για μένα.
Είναι και αυτό που
Δεν κάνουμε τίποτα. Την πολιτεία μας φτιάχνουν. Δεν είναι θέμα.
Αυτό είναι
κάτι και για τον έξω. Πρέπει να φτιάξουμε την πολιτεία μας. Η πολιτεία σου δίνει ισχυρή εξωτερική. Κανείς αδύναμος εξωτερικό και εξωτερικό να κάνει.
διαβάζω τώρα κάτι μνημονεύματα άλλων διπλωματών πριν αφαιρεθεί η Κύπρος. Και το θέμα είναι ότι ο φόβος, οι Έλληνες πολιτικοί και τότε ακόμα, που ήταν καλύτεροι από τους σημερινούς, φοβόταν να ανεξωσούν. Ήταν κάτι το απίθανο.
Ότι υπάρχει και σε φέρεις, πήγαν
Όχι, λέω για
μεγάλοι.
πολιτικούς.
Ναι, αλλά επηρέαζε και επηρέαζαν και αυτοί.
Γεια σας.
Διάφορες φορές.
Είναι σημαντική. Όχι για το